So there's another quote from the Uttara Tantra that says, just like the waxing moon becomes ever and ever more clear, as you also gradually gain a vision of the Dharmakaya. So that is in the Uttara Tantra, a verse which is explaining the way that the progression of the path will be experienced. So what that example is that in the lunar calendar, from the first day of the month through the 15th, the moon is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger until on the 15th, you see the entire moon. It's the full moon. And so for a bodhisattva who is practicing the path, then they will gradually see the Dharmakaya similarly to the way that you'll see the moon, like it greater and greater vision of it. And so the way that we will see that is that right now our practice of emptiness or our experience of luminosity is still what we would call a conceptual practice, or a conceptual, it's still using that aspect of the meaning generality. Like I said, it's still kind of an idea of something appearing in your mind. And so it is like that way that we're practicing right now, based on kind of an intellectual understanding. And so by practicing that, we gradually move forward and start gaining more experience. And even though it is still conceptual, it still counts as like a legitimate meditation on emptiness. And so that meaning generality, or that intellectual or conceptual vision, becomes closer and closer and closer to reality, to the actual vision of reality. And it's kind of like starting off with seeing a reflection of the moon, and then gradually getting closer and closer to seeing the actual moon. And so at a certain point, and in Dharma terms we say this is the first bodhisattva level, or bodhisattva bhumi, at that point, one first sees the actual reality, like directly. And so that is like on the first day of the new moon, when you're seeing a very small sliver of the moon, but it is the actual moon. It's no longer just the reflection image of the moon. You're actually seeing the moon directly. And so this experience, even though it is like small, or you could say partial, it is actual reality, the real nature or reality of your mind, or we can say luminosity of your mind. And it is a direct experience of that. But there's a difference between the direct experience that you have initially and the full measure of that. So just in the same way that there's a difference between the small sliver of the moon that you see, even though it is the actual moon, and seeing the full moon on the 15th. And so the difference is described in terms of the extent of the clarity, the vastness, and the, you could say, like completeness of your vision of reality. And so gradually, you're starting by only seeing the small sliver of the moon, and you, on the 15th, then see the entirety of the moon completely and perfectly. And so the timeless awareness, or the luminous wisdom mind of the Buddha, is like the moon on the 15th. And our practice starts off with just having kind of an image, like kind of like a reflected image or a reflection of the moon. And gradually we move into seeing a sliver of the moon, and then we start to see more and more and more of the moon, like that. And so that's the way a practitioner, like a bodhisattva practitioner, will gradually gain experience, gain realization of this reality. So even on that first day of the new moon, that sliver of the moon, we're only seeing a little tiny piece of the moon. But at that time, it's not as if the rest of the moon doesn't exist. It's still there. It's just that our vision of it is limited. And so there's no difference from the perspective of the moon itself on the first day of the month or the 15th of the month. There's only a difference in the way an individual is able to see it. And so that Buddha nature is like the 15th, the moon on the 15th, the full moon, which has all of the qualities of Buddhahood completely perfect, even within us. Although we right now are not able to instantaneously, all at once, reveal or have all of that perfectly manifest to us. But those qualities are perfectly there, even now. So in that text, then, in the teachings on this, then it uses this example of the moon, the increasing vision of the moon from the 1st to the 15th, to describe, or to exemplify, you could say, the traversing of the paths of bodhisattva practice in terms of the increasing experience of luminosity. So it's really important for a practitioner to know that the deeper one goes in terms of their practice, then the more and more and more vast or extensive their experience or their vision of luminosity will become. And so at this point, generally, it would be good to and appropriate to understand exactly what is the Buddha and be able to identify what is the Buddha, what is the Dharma, what is the Sangha. And in Uttara Tantra, in the Uttara Tantra Shastra, in that text, it talks extensively about the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and from a different perspective, a particular perspective about what that is. But for us, it's better not to get into too much of that. And what we're really talking about here as our primary topic then is that Buddha nature, which is the cause, you could say, for us to be able to become Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha ourselves. And so when they talk about in the Uttara Tantra, when it describes the qualities of Buddhahood, it's talking about a really incredible explanation of the qualities of Buddhahood. You know, normally often when we hear about the qualities of a Buddha, we're thinking about a person and like what a great person or what a wise person, something like that. Like when we take refuge vows and we take refuge in the Buddha, often we're talking about some enlightened or wise person. But in the Uttara Tantra, it's describing Buddha as like this ultimate state of wisdom. And so it's a very particular way of talking. So just to keep a little bit of a connection, because I said it would be good to talk about Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha here, I'll just say a little bit about when we're talking about Buddha, what we're really talking about is someone or a state of mind, you could say, which has completely eliminated all faulty or mistaken states and which has perfected or fully revealed all of its innate qualities, such as some of those innate qualities are like the two levels. There's another way of talking about the two levels of wisdom and knowing everything in its nature versus knowing everything in its variety, and so forth. So anyway, in the Uttara Tantra itself, there are separate sections giving like 8 special qualities of Buddha, 8 special qualities of Dharma, and 8 special qualities of Sangha, and then explanations of each of those. And so then when it talks about Sangha in the Uttara Tantra, it talks about it from 2 perspectives, a perspective of awareness and freedom. And so there are 4 qualities of awareness and 4 qualities of freedom given. So basically it's talking about in awareness, it's like some realization. And when you realize something, you become free from something, the mistaken perception, you could say. So just like an example that's given in the text is that like elephants sometimes get stuck in the mud. So they're like bound, they're like stuck. And then when they're liberated, they, are able to free themselves from that sticky situation or that bondage. So anyway, the way that Uttara Tantra describes Sangha is anyone who has some level, to some degree, the qualities of awareness and freedom. So the way that they talk about Dharma then is in terms of cessation and a path. So the same terms that we used in the Four Noble Truths. We have a state of freedom, kind of, or a state of cessation, and a path that leads to that. So it's talked about in terms of, like, if you were to overcome some antidote, or some faulty state, or some diluted state, then you will, in the cessation of that, you'll gain some qualities. And then, so Dharma is talked about in terms of the attainment. That means like the cessation of something faulty, as well as the thing that caused that cessation, the antidote. So like the thing that you were practicing, or the state of mind that led to overcoming the faulty state. So it's both the state of being separated or ceasing, or that afflictive state ceasing, as well as the state of mind which led to overcoming that mistaken perception. And there's an important line in this where it says that the antidote is the antidote which is pure and clear, or pure and luminous, you could say. So pure means that antidote removes or purifies or removes, you could say, the afflictions of attachment, aversion, stupidity, and so forth. And then as those are removed, then the appearance or the experience of primordial wisdom or timeless awareness becomes more and more clear or luminous. So when we're meditating, to think back on these terms, it's important that when we're meditating that our mind is becoming or is in a state or is becoming in a state which is becoming purified of these afflictive mental states, And in the absence of them, or in that state where they are purified, that there is becoming more and more clarity or illumination in your experience. And so, of course, for like these like noble beings or like bodhisattvas who have had a direct experience of reality, then they don't have that dullness or sleepiness of meditation. But when we say like purity and clarity, or purity and illumination, it's not only an absence of afflictions, but also an absence of like dullness and sleepiness, but that there should be like this illumination or wakefulness, clarity of mind. And one really important thing when we say Dharma or we say the word path, a path is a state of mind. And so if we were to go into the actual text, then it gives a verse of summary, like for example about each of the three jewels, and then an extensive explanation, and then a verse of summation for each one. And here we only touched on it a little bit because I mentioned it and I wanted to not leave that absent. I wanted to make that connection because we already talked about it. And Rabjam Rinpoche, Shechen Rabjam Rinpoche, he says, even a small little candy is still a candy. Like, even I only give you a little touch, it still was an explanation of the three jewels, even if it's not a huge explanation. So I have now covered, a small portion or a small explanation, you could say, of this Buddha element or Buddha nature. And so now, as part of a like kind of concluding section, I want to talk about some things that I think could come up for you subsequent to this teaching, some doubts or even mistaken kind of ideas that could come up in the wake of this teaching. So when the Buddha had given the teachings on the Buddha nature, in his retinue of students, there was a student who asked, he said, so this Buddha nature that you have taught seems very similar to what in some other Indian teachers, at the time of the Buddha, teach as that they call the great Maha-Atman, like the great self. So what's the difference? So someone asked the Buddha that. And so the Buddha said that these are not the same thing. They are not similar. And the reason they're not similar is first, there's a teaching called the Three Gates of Liberation. And later you should look into that maybe, or maybe you'll hear about it later. But anyway, the first of those is that the essence of everything is emptiness. And so in those non-Buddhist schools, they never say that the great self is empty or is emptiness. But the Buddha nature, this timeless awareness of Buddha nature is essentially, or is its essence, its nature is emptiness. And so we could get further into that discussion, but I think it would just cause more confusion to go in and talk about each and every one of the distinctions that are made in some of these teachings between this non-Buddhist idea of the great self and the Buddhist idea of Buddha nature, but I think it would probably just cause more confusion if I went point by point explaining that. So to summarize, the idea is, or the point is, that the Buddha nature is described as the actual nature of your own mind. And when you look at that nature, you find that its essence or its nature is emptiness. Like we were talking about that emptiness is form is emptiness, form is back and forth way. So from the power, or you could say the energy of emptiness or the openness of emptiness, that nature of mind can appear in any way. And so other than that, there isn't some kind of thing that you can point to as Buddha nature that is some solid, truly existing thing that you could see with your eyes or think of with your conceptual mind. It is essentially, or it is empty in its essence, meaning it's not some kind of solid, singular, truly existing thing. And so, Mipa Rinpoche, there's a aspiration prayer, and in that says that because the essence is empty, or because they are essentially empty, because it is essentially empty, it's beyond the extreme of permanence, or beyond the extreme of existence, or beyond the extreme of some kind of supposed belief in true reality or true existence. That, no matter how much you examine things, you never find some kind of solid, truly existing, permanent, sustaining, ongoing thing. And so that is what, in those non-Buddhist schools that talk about this great self, they say that it's permanent, it's eternal, it's unchanging, it's this, like that. So that's the main distinction there. And so you might think, okay, well, if it's not permanent or if it doesn't really or truly exist, then maybe it's non-existent. But that's also not the case, because even though it is empty in essence, it is naturally luminous. It is in its nature, or you could say its essence is emptiness, but its nature is to illuminate or to be illuminated. By its essence of emptiness, it is free from the extreme of, you could say, existence. And from its natural luminosity, it's free from the extreme of non-existence or of nihilism or nothingness. Because the appearing aspect or the luminous aspect is still there. So therefore, it's beyond either of these kinds of dualistic extremes or sides that you might try to attribute it to. And so then, therefore, it's not like this great self. It isn't a permanent thing. It is beyond the extremes of permanence and annihilation, or permanence and nihilism, or true existence and nihilism. So it has the essence of emptiness, natural clarity or luminosity, and an innate responsiveness that's all pervasive, meaning that it knows things, it can engage things. And those qualities are present within the minds of all beings. And so first we need to, for ourselves, we need to come to a definitive understanding, or we need to kind of confirm, like, what is that reality? Then we need to receive meditation instructions in that, and then put them into practice. And as we put them in practice, then we will arrive in this state being described here. So I think that, like, for what I had to say, that's it. I think that's sufficient. And so I would like for you guys to ask questions. Let's have some discussion.
Great question, Justin.
Yes.
Yeah, so the goal is this, at least in my experience, there's been some good things that have come from meditating on the things that Khenpo has gone through today, and he's elaborated further on now with the non-self. How does Khen Rinpoche advise conducting oneself within a culture that seems to be so radically self-bound, or in some cases selfish, and what seems to be a bit narcissistic, to say the least? Because, back to the idea of, like, the openness or the luminosity of, like, the young children, we're conditioned within the culture to really, in some cases, be very selfish or even greedy. And so, hanging on or continuing to have that sort of openness of non-self and that sort of light of, I don't know, I see it sometimes as creativity or imagination, that it seems to get harder as the years go on. And so how to, engage others within that system.
So I want to know from you, like, what do you see that's so, like, problematic or contradictory in you trying to experience or practice selflessness and everyone else believing in the self, like, or being selfish? Like, what's the problem? Or where's the contradiction for you in that? Or what's the sticky point?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like that's something to think about.
So maybe just think about that a little bit, and let's take another question and we can come back around.
Okay.
Yeah. Is there anything in the chat, Rachel?
Yes, there is a question here. Okay, so if I don't have a self, where is this Buddha nature, or who or what has it?
And so the other day I talked about how you have your mind, your ordinary mind, but that the actual nature of that mind is the Buddha nature. So it's not as if that there's a you or there's a mind and then there's this other thing called Buddha nature that you somehow possess. It just is the actual nature of your mind. So we were talking about mind, and we said that mind is something which is clear and aware and knowing. It also can appear as attachment, aversion, or all kinds of thinking. And then I said, is that all there is to mind, or is there something deeper or something more profound to that we could penetrate or that we could go into? And so when we went deeper, we talked about this Buddha nature, what we call Buddha nature. So we just need to think about Buddha nature as the actual nature of our mind and not some separate thing, something out there.
There's another question here in the chat. Could Rinpoche just say again the connection between emptiness and the Dharmakaya?
And so the Dharmakaya is what we could call the expanse of emptiness. But remember, this is like the emptiness aspect of your mind's nature, something like that. When it is completely separated from all of the temporary or adventitious or faulty states. So generally there's a huge explanation that you could give where there's like the 21 factors of the absence of contamination in this basic space, and there's a whole big explanation that could be given about that. So let me give you one kind of example. Like right now, when we meditate on compassion, it's something that we would call contaminated compassion, because our idea of compassion is still mixed with or still affected by our afflictive emotions. It's still like partially afflicted by ordinary desire. And so at a certain point, as we practice that more and more and more, and we practice emptiness more and more and more, we'll get to a point where our experience of compassion is no longer in any way mixed with or contaminated by this dualistic framework or this afflictive emotional states. And we'll have an experience of where our experience of emptiness and compassion are inseparable. And that's described as a quality of Dharmakaya.
Geraldine, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, please. Rinpoche, you remember us that the Buddha nature is not permanent, is nothing permanent, but in the Dzogchen approach, we have also the notion, very important, that the state of Rigpa is very stable, immovable, always present in all the states of samsara, in all the 6 bardos, transcending the 3 times. Mm-hmm. So we have the impression that there is a sense of permanence in that, you know.
Mm-hmm. So those same words are even used in the Uttara Tantra. So I'm going to answer you from that perspective. The unchanging, stable, and so forth, that type of language is even used about Buddha nature in the Uttara Tantra. So there is even an expression, a way of talking about a kind of permanence, you could say, in the Uttara Tantra, but it's not at all our ordinary way of talking about permanence. So when we normally talk about permanence, what we're talking about is assuming that an object or a thing, whatever, it exists, it's real, and then that real thing is permanent and unchanging. That's what we normally mean by permanence. So the way that it's talked about in Uttara Tantra is that from the very beginning, you're not talking about something that phenomenally or on an ordinary level is considered to exist. From the very beginning, its nature is emptiness. So like when we say exist, we're already into the realm of like fixating on it being something at the expense of being something else. Like you're already falling into an extreme. So we're not even, from the very beginning, when we say that all of these qualities of that the Buddha nature is there in beings, that all these qualities are primordially present, that those qualities are there and equally there at the time of an ordinary being, at the time of a fully enlightened Buddha, or even at the time of the practice of the path of a bodhisattva, that those qualities don't increase or decrease throughout that time. But we're not even starting from the beginning by saying that those qualities truly exist. So like our ordinary talk or discussion of permanence versus impermanence is already working on the ordinary phenomenal level of assuming something really exists, and then on the basis of that talking about whether it's changing or unchanging. And this perspective of Uttara Tantra is already starting from a perspective where this Buddha nature is the nature of emptiness. So it's essentially empty, naturally luminous, and so forth. So it's an entirely different way of talking about that.
In fact, I was asking my question, from the perspective of the Dzogchen practice, when we have been introduced to Rigpa, then all our Dzogchen path is based on this Rigpa with unchangeable all over you know, in all states of the six bardos, of night and day, this Rigpa that we have recognized, even though it's, of course, the union of emptiness and clarity, of course, but there, in the sense that it is always there, always present and changing, there is this sense of permanence, you know, permanence.
Yeah, I think that the distinction that we're making is that when we say permanence, in the ordinary sense, and in the sense of like when we say permanence, when they were talking about the permanence of the self or the permanence of the great self, you're already starting in that discussion of permanence by saying that something exists. And here, in Dzogchen or here, they wouldn't say that Buddha nature or Rigpa exists. It's beyond the ideas of existence, non-existence, both, neither, all conceptual elaborations. So there's no discussion of permanence. Even though,
But the question is not if Rigpa exists or not, but there is this characteristic of Rigpa that is always present and unchanging in the experience, you know?
So Khen Rinpoche is just answering basically whether you want to call it Rigpa or not. It's the question remains, or the point remains, because in this discussion, you know, we're talking about, I understand that you're talking directly about your own practice, but here, if you were trying to say that Rigpa is permanent, then you're already saying that it exists as soon as you put that label on it. And as soon as you say it exists, then that means it's not empty. And if you say it's not empty, you're already far away from the view of Dzogchen. You're not talking about Rigpa anymore if you say that it exists and it's permanent. And so right now I'm trying to focus in on the, you know, what this is talked about in the sutra tradition, but anyway, it's the same discussion anyway in this point. You know, as soon as you try and ascribe a state of permanence or an ordinary phenomenal existence, then you're saying that thing now is no longer inherently or essentially empty. You're now saying that it is truly existing.
Yes, but there is still the point that Rigpa is always there. If Rigpa was impermanent, you know, we couldn't have a realization. If it was like a mental state, impermanent and so on, you know what I mean?
Yes, but it's also not impermanent. That's the problem. So even as a Dzogchen practitioner, if you try to say that Rigpa is permanent, it's not very appropriate, not very convenient. And so, you know, speaking from that perspective, like the practice of Dzogchen, you know, from the very beginning, doing the distinguishing samsara from nirvana, doing Rushin, and all of the mental training that you do before you get into the main practice, you should have already come to an absolute conclusion about the nature of emptiness. And as soon as you're trying to say that it's permanent, you're already falling out of emptiness. You're falling into a framework of permanence versus impermanence. So the essential nature of emptiness is like you should already know that it's beyond the ideas of permanence, impermanence, and so forth. And so Mipam Rinpoche says that in order to come to a decisive, you know, conviction about primordial purity, you have to perfect the view of Prasangika Madhyamaka, the middle way philosophy. So you have to have a perfect conviction about emptiness from the sutra perspective to understand primordial purity from the Dzogchen perspective.
I think you didn't understand my question because of my bad English.
No, I totally understand.
No, maybe I didn't ask correctly things because of course I know all this because as soon we are on the Dzogchen path, you know, these kinds of questions are not relevant at all. We are beyond the conceptual level, of course. I don't try to establish in any way a permanence or impermanence, you know?
Yeah.
It's completely stupid from a Dzogchen perspective. But I was talking more about the level of experience, you know?
Yeah.
When you train to become stable in Rigpa, you know what I mean?
Yes.
There is this stability of Rigpa, of the Dharmakaya always present. I was talking about this, but maybe you didn't understand.
No, I understand. But the second you try and put it in words, you're already
It's difficult to put in words.
Yeah, as soon as you put it into words, then you're associating ideas, and those ideas are already separating it from being what it really is.
Yes, of course.
Yes. So if you want to follow up with that, we should talk about that privately. I think it's better not to get into this whole discussion, and particularly on that topic, and take up a lot of time for everyone else. So like if we talked about this privately, I could talk about this exactly on the level that you're talking about. But right now we're speaking about a topic which is more for the public, and I can't speak openly about what you're trying to talk about.
Yes, excuse me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question about virtuous states of mind.
Uh-huh.
Virtuous states of mind from
Sure.
session 1.
Yes, yes.
I wonder if Rinpoche could talk a little bit more about restraint and ethical discipline.
Mm-hmm.
Just give some examples of that.
Okay, yeah. And so the mind of restraint, you could also, in certain, the word for restraint in Tibetan is the same word of to take a vow. So in a certain sense, like if you were to take a vow, like the vows of the layperson's vows or the vows of refuge, the vows of a monastic, something like that, on a certain level, you're committing to restraining from some kind of behavior. For example, like Khen Rinpoche gave examples like, I have taken a vow, so in my mind, I have committed myself not to kill, not to take what's not given, meaning not to steal, not to lie, and so forth, not to harm others. So those are like mental states. I'm in my mind, I am committing to restraining myself or refraining from doing certain things. And so from the very beginning, when I became a monk, the first vow that I take is not to kill. And so, the vow is like a commitment in the mind. And so it's primarily actually as a monk, it's not to kill people, actually, like literally, like that's what would break your vow and cause you to no longer be a monk. But essentially vowing not to do some action, like I could kill with my body, for example. But I can't necessarily restrain my mind from not having some thought. I don't break my vow by potentially thinking that I want to kill someone or something like that. But for actually doing it, I'm vowing not to actually do anything. And then on the bodhisattva level, so the first is the vows of monasticism, or what we call individual liberation vows. On the second level, the bodhisattva level, then we not only, of course, commit to not doing the action itself, like killing, for example, but also even the intention. So we also take a vow not to ever even intend to harm others. And then we even also commit even further to do the opposite, to commit ourselves to protect others or help others. So that's what's meant by, mind of restraint or ethical discipline.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Renee, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you.
My question is actually kind of adjacent, I think, to a question you've just answered, but I've had this burning question for some time regarding discernment and stability in the view.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just sort of continually frustrated by the apparent, let's say, post-meditative apparent return to faith in
Ordinary
the three
reality.
spheres. Yes, exactly. And then the doubt in experience of, let's say, sublimity.
So one thing that happens is that when we arise out of our practice, we enter into a different level or a different way of perceiving. So like when we're practicing, we're focusing inwardly, and mainly the main kind of dominant part of our perception becomes our mental consciousness, you could say, our thinking mind or our mental consciousness. And when we get back up, our perception is dominated by our five senses. And so it is only a Buddha who has the perfect inseparability of what they experience in meditative equipoise and in their non-meditation, like their day-to-day, life. So, but I think there's nothing to worry about there. It's like you just have to keep focusing in on your meditative sessions, and it will start to influence your post-meditation. And if you're able to, start trying to apply the view, start trying to carry over the meditation into your day-to-day life. And even if you're not able to, just trust in your practice and don't get fatigued by it, and it will start to carry over. Even, if you're feeling like the meditation is like working while you're sitting, but it feels like it's not carrying over, it's not helping you in the post-meditation, that doesn't mean that it's not helpful to keep doing. So let me explain how this is still working, how this is still helping. From the Buddhist perspective, we believe that there will be a future life. And we also know that we will die at some point. And at the time of death, from the time after we die and before we take on a new form, there's a situation that we call the bardo. And in that first part of the bardo, the first moment after death, then we not only become kind of separated, you could say, from our coarse body, but also all of our coarse mental states. At that point, we're not only separated from our body, we're separated from all coarse states of mind. And in that state, the first moment, or that first bardo, is an experience of emptiness. So to prepare ourselves to be able to see that or recognize that, we have to meditate on that while we're still alive. It's like right now, it's as if like we know that we're going to have to go to war. We have to learn how to fight first. And so like we've been talking about these kind of states of mind, that there is this coarse or afflictive kind of dualistic framework of mind, and then that there's something else there, like something else more pure, something there. And so we're not talking about something that's like some abstraction. It's something that you can actually experience. And so we can, if we are able to recognize that appearance or that situation of emptiness in the bardo, we can become liberated from samsara in that moment of the bardo. But to do that, we have to be able to recognize that. So to do that, we have to practice in our ordinary life to be able to recognize that. And so that's one of our main intentions as, on the Buddhist path of practicing, is to prepare for those situations after death, to be able to recognize those states in the bardo. And so, even if we're not able to directly see the benefits right now, we still know that there's some benefit there. And even if we're not able to recognize that first bardo of emptiness, then there's another bardo with these other kind of experiential kind of appearances of luminosity. So there's another opportunity there. So anyway, this practice is still, beneficial, even if we don't see the immediate benefits. I think it's even helpful in starting to reduce some of our problematic senses of difficulty and frustration and those kind of things.
Yeah.
And so that happens to us too. It happens to all of us practitioners, that we start to feel like we're making progress in the session, and then we come out and we're like, oh, what happened? And so that happens. But, we shouldn't sit around thinking about that as problematic, and just actually take as our fundamental assumption that it's working, that it's benefiting us, it's helping us, and just keep moving forward with that assumption, with that as our framework.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'm particularly kind of stuck on this phenomenon that appears to be doubt. I should say, I do feel the benefit afterwards. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But I'm kind of stuck on this feeling, this post-experiential doubt that the experience wasn't something I just made up, that I'm deluding myself about. Mm. Is that clear?
That the experiences in your meditation are made up?
Yeah, like if there's, a really sublime sort of wisdom feeling where I don't want to articulate it too much, but I think you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. That then later I think, oh no,
And so what is your level of practice? Are you a traditional Buddhist practitioner? Have you taken refuge in bodhisattva vows? Are you on a path, or what are you doing?
I'm on a path. Mm-hmm. I have taken refuge. I'm kind of on a great perfection path.
So, first thing I would encourage you to do is, if you're practicing great perfection things, I would encourage you, before you start any meditation session, to really focus on and really like try and develop or really focus in on your practice of Guru Yoga before you start a meditation session. And then once you've done that and you're getting into like the actual meditation, just follow whatever instructions you were given for how to rest in that state or how to be in that state or sustain that state. Just keep doing it and don't doubt yourself. And when those thoughts come up or doubts come up, just look directly at those. And I think if you just keep moving in that direction, that will clear up that hesitation.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Wesley, did you clarify your question at all, or do you want to come back around to that?
You know, interestingly, I feel like Kempo has answered my question in the last couple questions.
Okay.
It is on this issue of like, you know, the personal practice, reconciling that with things that maybe come up in conventional reality. Like in my profession, I'm working with young people who have addiction or trauma and things of this nature. Mm. And sometimes, you know, it's very similar to the last question. You know, the doubt will come up in the carrying over of my practice with what I'm myself even sometimes coping with and working with young people who have sometimes some severe afflictive states. And it's not like I can just, you know, start teaching the Dharma in the middle of public education or something. You know, it's not, it just doesn't work that way within the conventional system, right? So
there's I quote, it won't sound that interesting in English, but it's funny in Tibetan just the way it's said. But anyway, it says like, the Dharma world and the worldly world are different worlds, something like that, you know? Hmm? Yeah, or maybe I should say the Dharma perspective and the worldly perspective are different, something like that. So like your perspective on things and the way that the people you're working with are experiencing things are going to be different. And so there's one explanation of what is the Buddha's perception of us? So there's an explanation of that in the Uttara Tantra as well. And so it's like the question or the doubt that is raised in the Uttara Tantra is if the Buddha perceives our difficulties and problems and afflictions, then how could you say that the Buddha's perception is pure if he's perceiving our impurity? That's a question in the Uttara Tantra, like a doubt that gets brought up. And if the Buddha doesn't see our afflictive states, then how can you call him the omniscient one? He's just, blind to our suffering or something like that. So does the Buddha see that? Yes, he sees it. But his own perception, his own perspective has been purified. So just because he sees the fact that we are experiencing problems doesn't mean that that has infected him or afflicted him. So there's an example given. So let's say I'm a person who's sitting here and I have a clairvoyance. I can read other people's minds. And right in front of me, there's someone who's having a terrible nightmare and they're not waking up from it. So I can see, because I can read his mind, I can see all the experiences, all the negativity that's happening, but I'm not experiencing negativity or harshness myself. But there's something I can do. What I can do is I can try and wake that person up. And so, but to do that properly, to wake that person up properly, you have to have the correct methods. Otherwise, you could just disturb them even more. If you yelled at them and pulled on their ear, you'd just piss them off. So, but you have to do this very skillfully. So it might start off with not actually giving them some like mental, emotional advice, but just helping them in an ordinary way in terms of their physical situation or whatever. And then slowly, as it may seem appropriate, you could start to give some kind of more, advice that might benefit their way of thinking or their perception, their mental kind of situation. Mm-hmm. So when you come and encounter someone who's, on a wrong path, you could say, or up to no good, a couple things could happen there. You could either fall under their influence and just end up falling into whatever kind of problematic thing they're doing, whether that's, drugs or whatever kind of negative behavior or whatever kind of negative influence they could have. Or you could maintain your integrity, not fall under the power of what they're doing, but understand what they're doing and use that as a way of understanding them more and gaining more compassion for them. And by gaining more compassion for them, but not relinquishing them, not pushing them away, you will gradually be able to positively influence them because of your good connection. And so, you can always take these situations as a way of increasing the power of your compassion, and then continue trying to find or seek out or even gain for yourself more skills to be able to help others. It's not necessarily always going to be the case that you're going to be able to directly help them in the way that you might intend. It might be something that slowly comes about down the way. We may not even be capable. We might not have the power in ourselves to actually do those things right now. But I do want to address one more thing, about a bit more of your question. There was another bit which I thought maybe was also related, where you were saying there is this sense of there's this idea of selflessness, or that there is no self. And then on the other side of the worldly way is that you kind of have to fight for yourself, or people in the world feel like they have to fight for themselves, or, they have to be assertive or even in competition with other people to try and get ahead. So there's that kind of maybe sense of a discrepancy or conflict there. So I think that there's a way to work with this in that, for example, anyone who is a lay person, a lay practitioner, meaning a non-monastic practitioner, we talk about as a lay bodhisattva, is still going to have to sustain themselves. You still have to make a living, right? But what I talked about is that once you enter the bodhisattva path, it's not that you have to change what you're doing, but you change your perspective in how you're doing it, or the motivation for doing it. So when you're making money to be able to help others, to be able to sustain yourself and others, to be able to support your family and be able to help others. And so it doesn't mean you have to change what you're doing. There's just a shift in the perspective and how you're doing it. And in that, I don't think it really helps to believe in a self. It's not believing in a self isn't helping you to do that. There's no benefit in not having a self, or not believing in the self isn't going to negatively affect your capacity to make money or get ahead or provide or maintain your sustenance or whatever. Where on the other side, if you are really fixated on yourself and your own benefit, your own needs, then that's going to cause problems. It's going to cause bad relationships in your outer world, and you're also going to bring that in and negatively influence with your selfishness your whole family situation as well, if you're only thinking about trying to help yourself. So there's a big difference between this kind of self-centered attitude of doing things and doing things with a perspective or from a perspective of wishing to benefit others. But just in general, the ordinary way that people learn to be in the world and what I'm talking about are not in harmony at all. But I think that's for each of you to investigate and see what works for you, or what that might bring to you to think in that way. And that applies for all of you.
There's a question in the chat from Mark. Could you talk a bit about the Sambhogakaya? How do we best train our minds in order to experience Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in their Sambhogakaya form?
So I'll talk a bit about that. There are very extensive explanations of that in our text, but I'll talk about it a bit. So I am sticking with the situation or the perspective of the Uttara Tantra text. So I'm speaking from that basis, you could say. So everything we're talking about here is from the perspective of someone who's practicing in the Mahayana path. So a practitioner, meditator who is a bodhisattva. And so from the very beginning of their practice, they are doing that with the motivation to benefit and liberate all beings. That's how they even how you even enter into the bodhisattva teachings is with that intention. So all of these explanations of the practices of the path, the stages of accomplishment, and so forth are all taking place within the perspective of or on the foundation of that attitude or intention. And so when you have transcended or gone through all of these stages of bodhisattva attainment and made it to the point where in the example you were at the full moon on the 15th of the lunar calendar, and all the qualities of Buddhahood are completely manifest in that state, that's what we call attaining Buddhahood or being a Buddha. That is Buddha. And so that state is a state in which anything that is not the nature of mind, meaning all ordinary states of mind, all afflicted states of mind, are now gone. They're purified. They're abandoned. You could say they have been transmuted. At any rate, what we're saying is that that state of Buddhahood, that full moon, is not stained by or not afflicted by or not affected by those ordinary states of mind. So that state of pure reality, which has had all of its faults removed and all qualities are perfect within it, is called Dharmakaya. And so at that point, you have all of these like qualities, perfected qualities of enlightenment, and that power, you could say, or that commitment of bodhicitta is still there. It didn't just disappear. So now what happens here when you get to the state of a result is, okay, now we've attained this result, then how is there going to be some activity or benefit for beings coming out of that state? So like, for example, when someone has finally been elected to the presidency, they finally have to come through with some of the things they promised when they were campaigning. In the Uttara Tantra, there's a quote that says that the Buddhas then will fulfill all desires or all wishes of beings, just like a wish-fulfilling jewel. Or there's another, Yishin Norbo Pak Samching. There are these examples in the sutras from like ancient India. So there's something called the wish-fulfilling jewel and the wish-granting tree. Anyway, it said that the Buddha's activity is like that, in that they will grant the wishes of anyone. There's no bias of I will do this for you and not for you. And there's not even any thought. The Buddhists don't think I'm going to help this or that person, but it's spontaneous. So it is through the coming together of you could say the bodhicitta commitment of the Buddhas, together with whatever are the capacities and needs of students, then a Buddha or Buddha activity, you could say, will appear according to the need of whoever needs it. So we don't see anything like a wish-fulfilling jewel these days, but in these ancient histories, they say that there was this jewel, and if you made some aspiration in front of it, it would grant whatever wish you made. But anyway, when the Buddhas need to do something, like do some kind of beneficial activity for beings, they have to have some kind of form that they can show. And when that form is shown or seen by a disciple, it can only be seen, or the Buddhas only show it, you could say, or the Buddhas the beings only see it in accordance with what they're capable of seeing. So I think it might be easier to understand if I use myself as an example here. So you look up and see me, and you see me as a person, as a monk. Similarly, the Buddha Shakyamuni, when he came to India and went to Bodh Gaya and attained enlightenment, he was in a human form, he spoke human language, he ate human food, and so forth. And so, that was like what an ordinary person would see, is like they would see a person, a monk. But if a bodhisattva, like a bodhisattva who has attained this direct vision of reality, saw me, they wouldn't just see an ordinary person. They would see something supreme, something superior, like a light body or something like that, you could say. Similarly, in the Nyingma tradition, when we talk about the way that these Buddha forms emanate or show themselves, they say that like Buddhas will show beings, like the beings of the six realms, in forms that accord to them. Like in the animal realm, Buddhas will appear as animals to help the animals, not as humans. And there are even stories in some of the sutras where the Buddhas emanated as other kinds of insects, and just the vibratory sound of their wings was heard by other insects, leading them to liberation. So they can appear as any kind of thing, like any kind of bird, wild animal, anything. Okay, and so anyway, what I'm saying is that the Buddhas have to show some kind of form, something that can relate to beings, and that can be appearing as some kind of living being, sentient being, or even as a non-sentient being, like as a flower or an object of some sorts, or as any kind of animal or human or other kind of being. And so those kind of things are what we call nirmanakaya. So because we can't see something beyond that, the Buddha looks like a person to us. And so the bodhisattvas then, this is coming around to the discussion of Sambhogakaya to answer your question, is that it's just like the Sambhogakayas are what can be seen by a bodhisattva. And so bodhisattva's state of mind is not like ours. Like when we're trying to meditate on reality, like I said, it's still very conceptual, very abstract. We're not directly perceiving that. And then the bodhisattva is like, somewhere in that realm of directly seeing the moon all the way up to close to the full moon. And so their perception of reality is direct, and so what they see is something different than what we see. Are we going to perceive things differently than a bodhisattva who's having a direct experience of reality? So therefore, they're able to perceive a different kind of level, or more pure, you could say, level of perception of the Buddha. So they see the Sambhogakaya. They see the Buddha as Sambhogakaya. And even the Dharma that they hear, they understand or they hear on a more profound or a deeper level. So to summarize, the Dharmakaya is the ultimate level of attainment, you could say. It's the actual nature of reality itself. And when we talk about Sambhogakaya and Nirmanakaya, we're talking about a way in which that can be perceived by, or that can appear to beings who are trying to train in the path, you could say. But you can't actually say that they're three different things. But we have to make a distinction when we talk about the way that they appear. So there's an example given for this in the Uttara Tantra. So there's a moon in the sky, right? Appearing in the sky. And this water right here is just super dirty, really filthy, dirty water. And then we've got another pool of water over here that's somewhat more clean. This water is extremely pure and clear. The reflection of the moon in each of these cups of water or pools of water, it's all the reflection of the same moon, but there's a difference in how clearly it can be seen in the three different cups. But that's only a distinction in the cups of water. It's not a distinction in the moon itself. We then can talk about that, from three different ways that would be perceived. Three different ways enlightenment is perceived according to the abilities or the clarity of vision of the disciple, you could say. And so also not just what appears in terms of some kind of physical form, but even the Dharma that they receive. So we talk about the teachings of the Nirmanakaya, teachings of Sambhogakaya, and teachings of Dharmakaya. We can even distinguish like three levels of teachings. And so to come back around to the example of me having attained enlightenment and then giving a teaching, that's going to appear in different ways according to whoever is receiving that. And so even that just happens in general. I was just speaking about that in terms of like the way that the three kayas might be perceived by different people, like if I were Buddha and I were teaching. But even right now, in our teaching right now, the same situation is happening. I'm teaching one thing, but there's a diversity amongst all of you in your backgrounds, in your sharpness, in all kinds of different faculties that is making all of you receive the same thing. I'm teaching one thing, but you're receiving it in many different ways. So I think that is a great example right there for what I'm even talking about, like the situation that's happening with us right now. So for sure, 100%, that is the situation with the three kayas. Like that's how that situation evolves, or how we can discuss that in terms of the perception of disciples. So that was great that question came up, because then we could give a more full perspective on all three kayas. I was worried that if I talked too much about that before, I was going to bore you. But anyway, it was a good opportunity that we got to sum that up. Okay, so anyway, I think that was a good auspicious note to end on. We're now out of time. And so this particular teaching came about because there are quite a few people, I see quite a few of you here on the screen, who have been attending some teachings through the Namchak Foundation over the course of the last few years. And we've kind of been building up in our practice and the level of our practice to the point where this is a really necessary teaching for you to talk about Buddha nature. So Namchak asked me to teach about this, about the nature of mind and Buddha nature. And so, as a practitioner evolves in their practice, this is an indispensable topic to learn about Buddha nature and about the Uttara Tantra texts. So it turned out really great. I'm very happy that we were able to talk about that. And similarly, I know there are some of you who are at a very high level of practice who are here listening. Some of you who are total beginners. Some of you who are somewhere in the middle. And no matter where you are, I think that this Uttara Tantra text and the topic of Buddha nature is indispensable. It's absolutely necessary. And so in our Nyingma tradition, we consider the Uttara Tantra text to be the text which bridges the gap between Sutra and Tantra. And in the Kagyu tradition, they consider it a very high-level topic as well, and they call it the Sutra level of the Mahamudra teachings. And so once you have turned your attention inwards, started practicing, and started gaining some kind of sense of the practice, some feeling of the practice, then this is extremely meaningful. If you've never tried that, if you've never practiced, I think it's a little bit hard to understand some of these points, though. And so anyway, I think that this teaching came about and ended quite with a great interdependence, a great auspiciousness. And also today is the 10th day of the lunar calendar, which for us is an important auspicious day. And I will also include you in my aspiration prayers, like, aspiring that all of you come to realize this true nature. So thank you everyone for joining and listening.
Yes.
Thank you to Rachel and the other Namchak employees who helped organize.
Yeah.
And then thanks to Justin, who's not only my translator, he's also my attendant, my helper. So he's doing everything here this weekend.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so thank you very much. This teaching is also kind of concluding my yearly teaching cycle with Namchak. So this is, a great ending. And so there's maybe some questions that I didn't get to, or some that I felt that I couldn't answer directly. So I apologize for that.
Okay, thank you.
And we're going to follow up with some study materials. I know that I mentioned that there's a free PDF of some pretty extensive teachings on the Uttara Tantra by Namchak Khen Rinpoche. There's also a really great video, another video of Khen Rinpoche teaching Buddha nature at the Buddha Garden a couple years ago. So we'll include links to all of these resources in a follow-up email that we'll send out to all of you sometime in the next couple days.
Good
Okay,
night.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Thank you, Justin.
Rinpoche, Rinpoche.
Oh.
Rinpoche, Justin.
Lase, lase.